Hey nerds, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to Growers Daily, your daily dose of ecological farming insight. It is Friday, January 10th, 2025. So indeed, it's Feedback Friday. But we will also discuss when to sow a crop and when to transplant one and how to get your garden beds to stay put. So let's do it. All right, so I hope everyone is having a normal start to their January, at least more normal than us. We're looking at several more inches of snow, more single-digit temperatures next week, and freezing fog, which I didn't even know that was a thing. But you don't tune in to get my local weather report, so instead, it's Feedback Friday, which means we will look back at your comments from the week and see what you all were saying about the various topics I cover. On Monday, I talked about the ice storm and pushing snow off the tunnels in preparation for it. There was a wide range of helpful and thoughtful comments that day, but I liked this from @DavidQuarles5965, who wrote, quote, when pulling snow off of the roof of a greenhouse, pull from both sides. That is 10 to 15 feet from one side, then walk around and pull off some from the other side. I have seen a greenhouse collapse when the grower pulled snow off one side, the other side pushed the greenhouse over and to the ground. These greenhouses aren't designed to withstand the sideways push of snow on one side, end quote. I'd not heard that before, but I like that idea. Maybe get a partner to go down the other side as you go down one side and help. I usually like to clear the snow before it gets too incredibly heavy, but it depends on what's in the tunnel and if I want some insulation, what the weather looks like coming up and that sort of stuff. A couple people suggested scraping snow from the inside by basically just pushing on the plastic underneath. The snow slides off and then you kind of just keep doing that down the line. But what I've found is that if I can get the half of it off first by scraping it from the outside, then pushing / popping it from the inside becomes easier and the snow pack slides off a little faster, which is what I did for my tunnels. I try to reduce the amount of time I spend pushing on the plastic from underneath because that motion can wear out your shoulders after a while, and maybe I'm getting to that age where stuff wears out your shoulders. But I also don't love pushing on the plastic from the inside out of fear of accidentally ripping a hole in it. This was especially true once we got an ice layer that was basically just a quarter or half inch of ice laid on top of it, and it made it really, really hard. But I appreciate everyone's ideas and thoughts on clearing the tunnel. It was very fun. Little nuances like that is what this show is all about. On Tuesday, we discussed do farmers need microscopes and also some of the changes going on with no-till growers, specifically that our budget has shrunk considerably and we're going to cease creating additional podcasts for the foreseeable future. I get into more detail there, but basically our goal is to give all of our information away for free as much as possible. But it's a complicated and challenging business model, as you can imagine. So we're taking a step back to reassess and figure out how we can continue to do that sustainably without killing or bankrupting ourselves in the process. I feel like this from @JohnRosier1686 summed up several of the comments I saw here with, quote, I'm definitely bummed that things are changing, but I understand and look forward to hearing what everyone is up to when that is possible. Thanks to Jesse Jackson and everyone else who have helped make this what it is, and all the best to all of them in 2025, end quote. Yeah, I mean, we're all bummed about it. But in a way, I'm glad so many people have expressed their sadness too. It means that what we've been doing has resonated, and also that the shows that decide to go independent will have that support, which I want to emphasize. Some of you will not really even notice a change because several of our podcasters are planning to keep their podcasts rolling. We will obviously help everyone to find those shows and boost those shows as much as we can and support them all that we can. We love our hosts dearly and all the work they've put in and appreciate all that they bring to this conversation. Also, in regards to microscopes, I liked this from @JJClark1313, who wrote, quote, this farm kid grew up to be a cell biologist partly due to my dad's microscope. Looking at samples through the scope piqued my interest in science that led to an interesting career, a goodly portion of it working with light, fluorescent, and electron microscopes. The everyday farmer probably doesn't need one, but I'm sure glad my dad did, end quote. Yeah, I love the microscope. My kids love it. I thought today, since obviously they don't have school, maybe ever again at this rate, we'd look at some melted snow under the microscope and see what we see. Kind of always science class around here. Wednesday, one of the main topics was soil testing, and got a few enthusiastic comments like this from @ExodusOfficer, who writes, quote, Please do more soil testing videos. It would be great if you could put the results sheet right on the screen and explain how to interpret it. They can be so confusing, especially for new users. It would be even better, maybe as a different video, if you had your first or other early soil tests available and could show the comparison between those and current test results. It would be really interesting to see how different soil parameters have changed under your management systems, end quote. I love those ideas, and maybe that is something I can pull off, but here's my great confession. You ready? Almost nothing excites me less than soil tests. I'm sorry. I just can't bring myself to care that much. And I know that is just not great as an agricultural educator. I care about the biological components. I care about the soil organic matter and soil respiration and microbial diversity. But the nutrient stuff is just hard for me. Part of this is just that the science is all over the place on efficacy and approach. Soil test recommendations can be inconsistent because although they may use similar assessment tools, they calibrate their recommendations differently, so recommendations can differ. Sometimes this leads to unnecessary recommendations, and so it can be hard to parse out what makes sense there. I do like your idea of comparing stuff, and I think it's a fine idea to test and apply the recommendations in the beginning of a garden or farm. But as a management tool, I'm still a bit incredulous, and maybe that's why I'm hesitant a little bit to talk too much about them. There's also no small amount of counter evidence when it comes to things like the Albrecht method soil testing. To be clear, I'm not saying soil tests are bad or wrong at all, and they deserve attention. For me, I've read multiple books on the subject, been to numerous talks on soil testing and nutrient balancing. It's just that I've also read a lot of the counter evidence and research in that vein, so I'm left feeling kind of meh. I also just personally prefer simple solutions like well-made composts and cover crops, which is a bit of a bias that I'll own. I'll admit to it. I also know people who love their soil tests and have had great results, so it's worth exploring, but you can maybe understand when I don't get super excited about the topic. But for you all, I promise, I will try to care more and be more open to soil test conversations. Then yesterday, I discussed briefly alcohol labels and how it contributed to a decline in smoking rates, and at Jared Jackson 1504 wrote, quote, taxes. I believe the steady increase of taxes on cigarettes over the past few decades did way more to curb smoking than labels did, end quote. Sure, taxes are part of it too. So was the increasing inaccessibility, like you couldn't smoke in bars and restaurants and stuff anymore, or other public places, and public support for banning smoking in public increased dramatically over the years due to campaigns on secondhand smoking and just the risks of smoking in general. Remember, it's never just one thing that makes a big change, and that's backed up by the research. It's possible we see increased taxes in the future on alcohol as well. We'll see. To be clear, I don't know if anybody's proposing that, but that seems to be the trend. We'll see. Yesterday, we also talked about agrivoltaics, and you all have lots of thoughts on this. At Told T wrote, quote, we wanted to do this 2 years ago, but the politics and regulations are prohibitive. We live in a somewhat rural area, and smaller utilities and co-ops are forced to buy a large portion of their energy and limited in how much they can produce. The biggest energy companies have a stranglehold on production, not unlike oil. Many rural areas also only have single-phase power, which is another limitation, end quote. Yeah, there have been pushes by energy companies in Kentucky to curb the access to solar power for homes. So competition and pushback from energy companies is a whole other factor that's hard to account for when it comes to these agrivoltaic systems or their potential. Anyway, thank you as always for all of your input. I obviously can't get to all of it, but I appreciate how smart and insightful our commenters always are. All right, I'm going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll get a question from one of our Patreon members, BRB.
Tell me and be honest. Tell me, did you know that you would believe in me just like the winners know? Tell me.
Today's episode of Growers Daily is brought to you by Peaceful Heritage Nursery. If you're looking for hardy and resilient fruit trees, berry plants, or pawpaw trees, then check out Peaceful Heritage Nursery. Peaceful Heritage Nursery LLC is a mail-order nursery shipping premium quality fruit trees and berry plants across the USA. They specialize in resilient, non-GMO plant genetics for small growers. Their diverse selection includes berries, cold hardy figs, passion fruit, gumi, mulberry, and much more. They're famous for their diverse selection of premium quality grafted pawpaw trees. 5-star Google ratings and customer testimonials attest to their commitment to excellence in quality and service. Find them at peacefulheritage.com and join their mailing list. Once again, find them at peacefulheritage.com. Use the promo code NOTILL, all caps, one word, for 10% off your first order. All right, back to the show. If you, the listener, are enjoying this content, getting even a small amount of value from it, consider supporting our work over at patreon.com/notillgrowers. I will try to get to questions from everywhere the questions come in, but I will always get to your Patreon questions. Now, today's Patreon question comes from Patreon member Chris Smith, who writes, quote, "Hey Jesse, as we close on the end of the year, I've been thinking about my farm-related New Year's resolutions. One of my main goals for 2025 is to be more on top of maintaining my beds and paths, and I was wondering if there were any good tips or tools you'd recommend for keeping my 30-inch beds at 30 inches. Thanks and happy holidays," end quote. Thanks, Chris, and happy New Year and all that good stuff. Obviously, this comment was before the holidays, but I'm getting closer and closer to being caught up, so I'm pretty proud of that. Please, Patreon members, don't hesitate to get your questions into the January show thread, because once I'm there, I'm going to blow through those too. Okay, so yes, when you are working in a large garden without permanent wooden borders, it is one thing to establish garden beds and an entirely different thing to keep them in the same place year after year. The reason for this is that you have to cultivate or plant or rake or harvest, and soil or mulch will inevitably fall into the pathways as you do those things. Gravity will slowly flatten the beds as well to the level of the pathways. All sorts of little changes can happen and make the beds shift around. Now, there are two simple things that can help keep your paths at the desired standard width. One is to center your tools around the size you are shooting for, i.e. get 30-inch or 15-inch rakes, use 30-inch mowers and power harrows. If those are tools that you use, these will effectively mark the width for you as you work with them, right? Like a 30-inch rake will mark 30 inches in theory, as long as you're keeping it relatively straight going down the bed. However, keeping the work straight is a bit of a challenge. This is why a lot of growers will place wooden stakes at 30 inches apart at both of the ends of their beds on each corner. So basically 4 stakes on each corner. We did a bed flip video with 10 Mothers Farm several years ago, shot by our buddy Josh Satin, that is worth watching, where they discuss how they do this exactly. And in fact, it's one of my favorite videos for the amount of detail they offer. I'm sure they've refined their process at this point, but I love that farm and that approach still works. So anyway, they set stakes at the edge of their beds so they can draw a string between them during every bed flip and use something like a tilter or whatever to incorporate the nutrients, the amendments, and then remove the string once the bed is reset for the next crop. Now, I'm perhaps too clumsy to have stakes at the ground at my feet year round. Anyway, yeah, you could also just put those stakes back in the ground once per year, just remeasure it, reset the beds, and then remove them, I suppose. That would add a little bit more work, so you'd have to factor that in. For me, I set the beds in the beginning when I'm establishing the beds, but only reset them to the right width if things get a little too funky. Generally, though, I can maintain roughly good 4-foot beds, which is what I use here as opposed to the 30-inch standard, just because I have the permanent living pathways kind of in the middle that don't move around quite as much as bare pathways would. Wood chips in the paths would perhaps likewise at least help for a little bit at keeping the paths and beds clearly marked. I like the wildness of my garden, and I'm okay with a little wonkiness here or there. When it gets out of hand, I just kind of fix it. But I want to emphasize that my laissez-faire approach here to managing garden bed width isn't always the best approach. It's just my personality more than any sort of recommendation. It works for me, but I also don't have the crispy bullet straight lines of other growers, which is fine for me. But if I were cultivating heavily with more specialized tools, that preciseness might become critical, and I'd probably use the stakes, to be honest with you. Or perhaps other growers can share their methods in the comments. Anyway, I'd be curious to hear if there are other ideas out there for keeping your beds in the exact place you put them. Otherwise, let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll talk about what we transplant on our farm and what we seed. BRB. Today's episode of Growers Daily is brought to you by Harnwah Greenhouses. Harnwah Greenhouses has pioneered controlled environment agriculture since 1965, partnering with market gardeners and farmers across North America to deliver turnkey greenhouse solutions. Their unwavering mission is to support growers' success through innovation and expertise in design, manufacturing, and installation. Harnwah Greenhouses are engineered to withstand high wind and snow loads, providing optimal brightness, increased yields, rapid ROI, and long-lasting durability. With over 20,000 projects completed, they are more than a manufacturer. They are a trusted partner. Their structures foster sustainable, energy-efficient ecosystems that drive profitable, resilient agriculture. In 2025, Arnois is introducing a new low-tech, high-tunnel model starting at just $2 per square foot, offering open field growers an accessible entry into controlled environment agriculture. Arnois Greenhouses, leading the way in turnkey solutions for local growers. Learn more at arnois.com. That's HARNOIS.com. All right, back to the show. All right, so I want to give a quick primer on how we approach seeding versus transplanting. On our farm, we transplant probably close to 90% of what we grow, give or take. So that means we grow the plants out as seedlings and plant them in the garden beds at our desired spacing significantly more than we just sow seeds directly into the garden. There are several reasons for why this is, but it largely boils down to time. The amount of time a garden bed gets to be productive in a year in our climate is really only from about like April until October, though you can fudge it a bit on either end. So that means to maximize that time, growers have to be incredibly strategic about how we plant and how long the beds are out of production, or how long the beds are occupied with plants that are just growing and not actually being harvested from. Transplanting the majority of our crops means that we can get a crop several weeks of growth before they ever take up space in the garden. It means we can germinate crops at times when the soil would be too cool and grow them large before they enter the garden. I like to think of the greenhouse as its own little intensive garden, but it gives us not just a huge jump on the growing season, but a huge jump on subsequent crops. Like if a crop is occupied with one, let's say beets or something, I can go ahead and get the tomatoes going while the beets are still growing, and I don't have to wait for the beets to entirely come out of that bed to put seeds in the ground. Yeah, saves a ton of time. Or to use a sports analogy, it's like the greenhouse is like having a crop on deck. Baseball. Yeah, I haven't mentioned that one very much. It's a good sport. Also, consistency. When you are making sure every crop germinates in a tray, well, your beds can stay fuller because you are putting the exact number of plants you need for the space out there in the garden, for the space that you have to grow. So there's no patchiness, there's no gambling on how much is going to go out there. You know as soon as you transplant it. Yes, it is more labor intensive to do it this way and more material intensive, but being able to take partially grown plants out instead of relying on seeds that could germinate poorly or be overrun with weeds or just not be very even makes a huge difference in potential success. Sometimes when you sow a seed, it could be a full week before you realize the seeder wasn't working properly. Transplanting kind of sidesteps that. Now, on a baby greens farm, you are likely going to seed a lot more crops than you transplant. But for most growers I know, transplanting is a huge part of the operation. So instead of giving you a list of crops that we transplant, which is most of them, how about a list of crops we don't transplant, or don't always transplant at least? This will be the easier route. First, carrots are a directly seeded crop, meaning I do not transplant those crops ever. I've seen people experimenting with transplanting carrots with things like the paper pot transplanter, but the roots can get a little funky when you transplant them, and the profit breakdown is going to be tough there. Ditto radishes and turnips and things like that, which are frankly so fast in germinating and growing, it really wouldn't make sense to waste the space in the greenhouse and labor for most of us to grow radishes or turnips in the greenhouse. Arugula and other baby greens are also something we will directly seed. Now, I have done some transplanting of arugula back in the day for bunching arugula, but for baby arugula, it's all about direct seeding. I will occasionally seed beets and spinach, but I generally transplant those as well. Typically just to get a jump on the season for beets. For spinach, sometimes I have to transplant our early fall spinach and late spring spinach because it's too dang hot for it to germinate in the field in the summer. And then also it gets too hot in the late spring to really get good germination on spinach. Also for the fall, it gives me a huge jump on the season. And if you can have spinach in September when we're still really busy at markets, that's an important and great market item. Corn I will both direct seed and transplant depending on what shape the bed is in. All types of corn, to be clear, do better in my experience if directly seeded, so I prefer to directly seed them over transplanting them. But sometimes if a bed has a crop in it, when I would like to sow the corn, then I go with the transplanting. I just try to get it in the ground as early in its growth as possible because the tap roots can be finicky. Sunflowers are actually somewhat similar, but I transplant the early ones and direct seed the later ones. Cover crops, obviously not transplanting those, though I could see the potential for occasionally adding a cover crop somewhere like in a really small garden that needs the space as long as possible by transplanting your fall-winter cover crops instead of trying to sow them. But for most of us, that would be a ludicrous amount of work. Lettuces I mostly transplant, except for the baby green, the baby leaf lettuces. Those are easy enough to sow. In the summer, germination of lettuce can be tricky, but we'll talk about that at a later date. And I've done videos on summer lettuce that you can watch. Beans, squashes, watermelons, cukes, tomatoes, peppers, all of those I transplant. Honestly, I'm sure there's a lot more I could say on the subject, but I'll let the comments do that, and I've got time to cover it more in the future. So for now, I think I'm going to wrap it up for the week. Happy Friday, everyone, and my love is still going out to our friends in Southern California. Really hope those fires ease up soon. Just can't imagine what you all are feeling and going through right now. Huge shouts to Willie Breeding for the theme music and the team at Notill Growers and Epidemic Sound, where we get background music. Pick up a copy of the Living Soil Handbook or the Seed Farmer at notillgrowers.com to support our work. You can always hit up the forum at notillgrowers.com if you want to chat with the other growers who are obviously into this nerdy stuff. Big thank you to everyone over at patreon.com/notillgrowers, where at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, or just sign up in the month of January, you get a shout out in the show. So big shout outs today to Forecaster, Jesse, great name. I heard it's one of the best. Malachi? I'm not sure that is Malachi. Malachi? All of the above. All three of them. William Hudgens and Jesse Hammond. Great name. I heard it's one of the best. All right, this one is giving me these names. This is giving me, especially with one like Forecaster, this one is giving me like it's a bit of fan fiction about the costume designers for Gotham's greatest supervillains. And they all like to regularly get together and discuss some of the challenges of sourcing materials and working with such personalities. Forecaster, who is famous for designing Mr. Freeze's outfits, costumes, but he doesn't like calling them costumes. Anyway, Forecaster is arguably the leader, but the politics are part of the entertainment of this particular work. So anyway, great stuff. Have a great weekend, everyone. Thanks for watching and or listening. We will see you on Monday. Bye.